The reason I don't want to throw out Freud is because the scientific study of subjective experience, that's the thing that was missing in neuroscience when I was young.
Yeah.
We want to bring subjective experience
Mhm.
together with the objective physiology of the brain so we can build a complete science of the mind and the brain. That is the thing that we had to recognize. The source of consciousness is not just a light switch in the brainstem. It is affect, it is feeling. So to everything that the cortex does can only be conscious if we feel our way into it. I must tell you, when I started working in that direction, I frequently thought I'm mad. You know, you keep on losing all confidence in yourself. But as we have done that work, so I'm increasing. And nowadays, it's not such a crazy idea. There's many people speaking about the possibility of artificial consciousness.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest star now in our symposium interview series. It's Mark Solms from South Africa. Hi, Mark.
Hello, good to meet you.
We are glad also to meet you too. We're delighted that you have accepted our invitation to take part in this symposium interview. And it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to ask you about the topics of neuropsychoanalytics, it's a little complicated word, or the role of feelings in the formation of consciousness. I think there are very interesting topics and we are very geared to get your answers to it. But perhaps you will first introduce yourself and your research work for people who should still know you. Thank you, Mark.
So thank you. I'm very glad to do that. I trained in the early 1980s in neuroscience. And the most interesting thing about the brain is the fact that it has subjective experiences. This is the unique feature of the brain, is that it feels like something to be a brain. There's nothing else in nature, as far as we know, that has this capacity. But there was very little emphasis placed on this. When I studied, I was frustrated that there was so little discussion of experience and subjectivity. So for that reason, I decided to study the one aspect of consciousness which was a respectable topic, was the sleep-waking cycle, the arousal of the waking brain and the states of sleep. In sleep, there is the remarkable fact that although we're asleep, we have conscious experiences called dreams. They punctuate the unconsciousness of sleep. So that was a way in which I could insert subjective experience into neuroscience, was to study the sleep-waking cycle, but in particular to look at why are we awake while we're asleep. So I was looking at the brain mechanisms of that. I made some completely accidental discoveries about the brain mechanisms of dreaming, which maybe we'll get to later. But that is what made me interested in psychoanalysis. The fact that my findings suggested that dreams were motivated states, that they were not random, and for reasons that I can describe to you later. Then I realized that psychoanalysis, for all of its faults, at least they do study subjective experience. That's what their main subject matter is. So I decided that I would train also as a psychoanalyst. This was in the late 1980s. And my colleagues were horrified. They said, for a neuroscientist to study psychoanalysis, it's like an astronomer studying astrology. But I never regretted doing that, because I really I learned a language, a conceptual framework for being able to think about and research the subjective lived experiencing mind. So I brought into neuroscience what I felt was missing in my training. But at the same time, by doing that, it gave an opportunity to bring the methods of neuroscience into psychoanalysis, because the great problem with psychoanalysis is testability. You know, it doesn't use objective methods. And so the rest of my scientific career has been doing that, trying to insert into neuroscience what we can learn from the psychoanalytic perspective, and trying to insert into psychoanalysis what we can learn from the neuroscientific perspective. And that's what resulted in this funny word that you mentioned, neuropsychoanalysis, is, I think, the best word to describe what it is that I've been doing over the last 35 years.
We have an interview with Gerhard Roth. You know him well before.
Yes.
And in this interview, he mentioned that he trained psychologists in neuroscience. I always think that psychologists have a deep impact in neuroscience, and they are not informed of it. And I say, no, it's not true. That he said that it's true. It's like an orthoped who don't know the bones. And, it's like, but it's true, no? It's true that this area is not so important in this study for psychologists. Huh?
That's right. It's crazy. The mind and the brain are so obviously the same part of nature. I like to say to my students, it's like the blind men and the elephant, where the one has the tail and the other one has the ear and the other one has the trunk, and each of them has one part of the thing. What they need to do is compare notes to combine the different perspectives they have on this thing. Then you get a more complete understanding of it. So I think it is really difficult to understand both why do psychologists know so little about the brain, especially psychologists who study subjectivity. People like psychotherapists, they know nothing about the brain.
Yeah.
And why do neuroscientists know so little about the mind? When a neuroscientist speaks about psychology, they mean behavior. They don't really mean experience. And so I'm very glad to have taken the path that I took. It was also quite nice, especially when I began, to combine these two perspectives. There weren't many people doing it. So it was like being a kid in a toy shop. Everything that you touched was interesting. It was, and nobody else was there to take it away from you.
We had also some interview partners, Dirk, that I think that had also these two different aspects.
Interdisciplinarity.
Interdisciplinarity, and it for us it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So to start, let's focus a little bit. You already did the bridge to the first question. Let's focus a little bit on psychoanalysis, which is maybe nowadays a little more necessary to explain than maybe 50 years ago, because it's from the end of the 19th century, no?
Yes.
And it's known already. So we had I don't know if you know, in Germany, a bestseller, which was called Der Trafikant. And there is a small boy in Vienna, and he's talking to Freud about his problems he has with a girl. So Freud is still known, and he's valid for novels. But you already mentioned it. There are still some criticisms on psychoanalysis. For example, that is not irrefutable.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a problem with empiric evidence. And there are also malicious tongues like Dietrich Schwartz, who wrote also 10 years ago a kind of encyclopedia of everything you should know. And he said the problem with psychoanalysis is that it creates the problems that it sold itself as a solution to. So what he wanted to say, I think, that you say you have this problem, but if you say that I have no problem, it's like a rectification. But you have the problem because you are suppressing your problem.
Yes.
So
yes.
Maybe you can tell us some things about the problems with psychology, of psychoanalysis, and what you think about to start.
Well, I think the first thing we have to remember, which you've reminded us of, we're talking about something that began in the late 19th century. So Freud is a historical figure. You can't judge the value of a scientist without locating them in a particular time. So we don't criticize Newton because Newton didn't know anything about quantum mechanics. Newton was a pioneer. The same applies to Darwin. Darwin didn't understand anything about genetics, and everything that we've learned using the tools of modern genetics, Darwin knew nothing about all of that. He didn't even know the laws of inheritance, but he understood something in a very broad way. He opened up an area of inquiry, evolutionary biology. Newton opened up an area of inquiry, physical mechanics. And Freud was like that. He opened up an area of inquiry, namely the inner life of the mind. There is a part of nature which is called subjective experience. It's wonderfully interesting that subjective experience exists. And Freud wanted to try to understand what are its major functional features. How is it organized? What causes these things? Of course, 100 or actually now 130 years ago, he saw some vague basic things, but he missed a hell of a lot of detail. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that at that time, there were no other methods. We didn't have, like we have now, you can do functional neuroimaging, where you can see what's going on in the brain objectively while you're having subjective experiences, and you can correlate those two sets of observations with each other. In Freud's time, that wasn't possible. So he made a number of conjectures. He made a number of hypotheses, a number of postulates, but they were not falsifiable using psychoanalytic methods. They were not. So that's why all of these criticisms, I think that they're perfectly reasonable to say, well, it's not falsifiable. There's no experimental verification of these hypotheses within psychoanalysis. That doesn't mean that you mustn't study subjectivity. I mean, you have to adjust your methods to the phenomena. You can't adjust the phenomena to your methods. So those days, the only methods that we had were purely psychological methods. There was no way to study the living brain and its internal workings while you're alive. It just wasn't possible. And now we have many, many, many powerful methods. I've mentioned functional imaging, but there are many more. I mean, like, for example, we have optogenetics, we have single cell recordings, we have deep brain stimulation, we have pharmacological manipulations, all sorts of things. And we can use multiple methods. And then that makes these hypotheses testable. I'll give you an example from my own research. So Freud said that dreams are wishful. Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, he said, well, my dreams aren't wishful. My dreams are horrible. And then he says, but the psychoanalyst will tell you, just like you said a few minutes ago, yes, but behind the dream that you remember, there's an unconscious wish. And Popper said, but how can you ever disprove that? No matter what I dream, you can find an unconscious wish because you're inferring it. But then I can't ever prove to you that there isn't an unconscious wish behind my dream. So that's because the method doesn't allow you to falsify it. That's a problem. Now, in my own dream research, the first thing that I discovered, which was a real surprise to me, was that damage to the part of the brain that produces, that leads to a loss of dreaming is in the dopamine pathways that link the upper brain stem to the frontal lobes. There's a dopamine pathway there. It used to be called the brain reward system. It was also called the wanting system or the seeking system or the curiosity, interest, expectancy system. These are all different names, and you can hear from the names: curiosity, interest, wanting, expectancy, reward. It's motivational, it's positive. If there's anything that's wishful, it is that brain system, that dopamine system. Damage to that system leads to a loss of dreaming, not to the part of the brain that generates REM sleep, but to this motivational circuit. So I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's from using lesion studies. Then we could look with positron emission tomography. You can look at the brain during REM sleep in a living person, and you can see where the activation is. It's in that system. So it shows the wishful, positive, motivational part of the brain is active during dreaming sleep. Then you can use single cell recordings. You can record from those cells, and you can see their fire in bursts. So that's using different methods to test those hypotheses.
Would you say this is a proof for something that Freud said and he couldn't prove in his time? Is there any connection of what he said?
Yes, there's a direct connection in the following way. I told you that Karl Popper's criticism was, you say to me on your psychological analysis that you infer that there's a wish, a positive motivation behind my dream, but how can I ever disprove that? If Freud had positron emission tomography, he could say, well, let's have a look. Is the wishful part of the brain active during dreaming sleep? I predict it will be. But he couldn't say that because you didn't have the methods. That's a directly falsifiable prediction. And it's not falsified, it's confirmed. I'm just giving you one example. The most important point is that those theories, those postulates, those hypotheses of Freud's, they were not testable those days. They are testable now. That doesn't mean we've confirmed them all. Many of them we disconfirm. But it's a starting point. It's a theoretical framework derived from the direct study of subjective experience. And then it says, this is what its underlying organization appears to be. And then you have to leave it to other methods to test whether those postulations are correct or not. Some of them are correct, some of them are completely incorrect, and some of them are somewhere in between the two. And in this way, you gradually develop a better model of how subjective experience works. That's what we're trying to do in neuropsychoanalysis, is to take those two starting points, the brain studied only as an object and the mind studied only as a subject, and to combine these 2 points of view. And in this way, we develop the field. It's not a matter just of proving or disproving. It's a matter of improving your understanding.
I get accustomed to this, Mark. And do you think that it's there a possibility to prove it, that emotions or feelings are mapped into the brain stem and to the limbic system, and you can prove it if the person gets fear or gets anger or are enraged? You can prove it in the with positron emission tomography. That's it's in some kind of area there. And then I have the question too: is it also possible that Freud are speaking always from symbolism, that the persons don't speak about their real problems, they put it away in another kind to manage it and use it some symbols for it? Can you prove it too? Is it also possible to prove such things now today?
So let me tell you, in neurology, there's a phenomenon called paraphasia, which is where the patient tries to speak, they do speak, but they don't use the words that they want to use. The wrong words come out. If you look at those, if you study those words, you find they're not random, that there is a semantic relationship to the target word. So the patient might want to say bottle, but they say glass. They might want to say wine, but they say water. So there's a connection, and you can infer, you look at the context, you can see this patient was actually thinking wine, but they said water. So the brain works like that. We have another phenomenon in neurology. It's called confabulatory amnesia. The patient has an amnesia. In other words, they can't remember, but they don't realize they can't remember. So they come up with false memories. That's what confabulations are. So what we do is we give the patient a story and we say, remember this story. Then we take the story away and we say, okay, tell me what the story was. and they tell us a whole lot of nonsense, which they think is the story that they remember. They think they're remembering it. Exactly the same as with paraphasia. You can show there's a meaningful relationship between what they say and what you originally told them. Like, for example, I'll just give you a random example. I have a patient, he was trying to find the thing that a piece of the brain that controls memory, that's missing. What he actually remembered is that there's a piece of a computer missing. It's called the C49 cartridge. And I said to him, what does that cartridge do? He says memory. So you see, it's like a dream. It symbolizes, it stands for the thing. I talked to him about a brain operation because he had a brain operation. And I said, now you must remember that you had a brain operation. So what did he actually remember? He remembered that he had a heart operation, and he remembered that he had a dental operation. So you can see he knows that there's an operation there, but he's getting the wrong one, you know. And by the way, his brain operation went badly, but his heart operation, which he had a pacemaker fitted, and his dental implants, they worked well. So he was remembering some good operations. And you can see, because you're testing it using a different method, you can see, you can show that this thing stands for that thing. So to put this in a bigger framework, in modern cognitive neuroscience, we know from all sorts of methods that there are two different memory systems. There's the non-declarative memory system, which we call implicit, and there's the declarative memory system, which we call explicit. And so clearly what I'm seeing in that patient, what I've just described to you, is that in the implicit memory systems, he has actually laid down the memory, but in the explicit memory systems, he's getting too fuzzy a relationship to it. So he's drawing up into declarative memory, something which is indirectly related to what's in the non-declarative memory. So this is a very standard way of thinking in modern cognitive neuroscience. All that you need to do is to join the dots and say, okay, so what we're talking about nowadays, when we speak of implicit and explicit memory, that's what Freud meant by unconscious and conscious. And you see there's this indirect relationship between the two. That's not to say Freud knew everything that we know now about the multiple memory systems. We've learned a hell of a lot more. And so we can build on top of those old ideas a much more sophisticated, much more elaborated understanding of how this kind of so-called symbolism works, how the one thing that stands for another thing.
Do you think that the model of unconsciousness and over I and it makes a modern rule for neuroscience? Because I think where we have to search when we search for something like unconsciousness, or it's more the location perhaps for it, but there was something like unconsciousness. It doesn't exist, or do you think so?
Well, let me tell you two different things in response to that. The first is, as I've just told you, our modern cognitive neuroscience picture of the memory systems of the brain is that they are indeed unconscious memory systems, they call the non-declarative ones, and they are conscious memory systems, they're called the declarative ones. So in that sense, Freud was right. When Freud said that in the 1890s, that there's an unconscious memory, everybody said, but if it's not conscious, it's not a memory. You know, that was the way. And now we say, no, it's not true. There are unconscious memory systems. But you asked about the superego and the ego and id. Freud said that in the id is unconscious, and the id is where our drives come from. Now, we can identify where in the brain our drives come from. Where are these basic motivational circuits in the human brain? They exist. They are brain circuits for all of our instinctual motivations, like sexuality and hunger and rage and fear and so on. All of these things, they are such circuits in the brain. And by the way, they're very similar in the human brain and the primate brain and the mammal brain in general, you know. So we are also animals, you know, us human beings. That's another Freudian idea. But those brain circuits are not unconscious. They are the source of consciousness. So they start in the upper brain stem, in the reticular activating system, and they ascend alongside all the so-called limbic circuits. These are the circuits in the brain that perform those functions, but they are the same circuits that generate consciousness in the brain. So there Freud was completely wrong. To say that there's an unconscious part of the brain is right. It's a memory system. And to say that there's an id is right, but to say that the id is unconscious is wrong. So this is how I'm saying you build up the theory. So now we would have to say, if you're wanting to use Freudian terms, you would have to say that the unconscious and the id are not the same thing. That the unconscious is a memory system, and the id is an arousal system, and they're in different parts of the brain, and they function in different ways.
This was a perfect bridge to another question, to consciousness, Axel, or do you have
one short question to this?
Yeah.
So could you say that the idea of Freud, that we have these three parts, the id and the ego and the superego, is still a valid idea that you can interpret in the frame of neuroscience, or is it an idea that we should do away?
So I would say that we can take those, because these are functions, Freud's functional systems. You can say, well, let's identify where in the brain these functions are performed, and then let's see, do they function the way that Freud said they did? Freud said there were two drives. In fact, there are at least 7. So, so you can take the theory and you can say, okay, let me find where in the brain that those functions are performed. And then let's see, did Freud in detail have it right, or did he have it wrong? The fact is, in broad brushstrokes, yes, these things exist. In the detail, they don't work the way that Freud said they did. That leads you to another question, which is, are these still the best concepts? Are those the best functional divisions? Should we say id, ego, superego? Is that the best way for us to, now that we know the details, is that the best way to organize the details? I'd say, no, it's not the best way to organize the details. But that's how science proceeds. It doesn't mean now we must demonize Freud. As I said, we don't demonize Newton, we don't demonize Darwin, we build upon them. The reason I don't want to throw out Freud is because the scientific study of subjective experience, that's the thing that was missing in neuroscience when I was young. We want to bring subjective experience together with the objective physiology of the brain, so we can build a complete science of the mind and the brain. And that's why I want to build on what Freud taught us. But it's not a matter of proving Freud right or wrong. It's a matter of finishing the job.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, Dirk, go ahead.
It's perhaps a good bridging to another question. Because the naturalistic approach to this problem, to this hard problem of consciousness, we always search for consciousness in neocortex, or we mapped consciousness always with cognitive things, and we always don't look at the bottom of it, that all these kinds of things emerge from feelings, that there are a brainstem which takes an arousal to all these things, and which you mentioned before, there have to be an initiation of all these kind of things. Always is there in neuroscience this third-person approach that we look at the brain, but we don't make some phenomenological approach to it, that we ask the person, how do you feel? What kind of feelings are immediately in you? And you take another approach to it. You use I find it very good, the title, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. You come back to the roots, I think so. Could you explain a little bit more in detail?
Yes. So starting with my dream research that I already told you about, I recognized that these deep brainstem arousal structures that switch on the lights of the cortex, and this is not a discovery of mine. We always knew since 1948, when Magoon and Maruzzi discovered the reticular activating system in the brainstem, which was a big surprise to them. Everybody thought, consciousness flows in with sensory perception. What Magoon and Maruzzi discovered quite by accident is that actually consciousness is generated deep in the brain and it activates the cortex. So the cortex that's receiving all this information from outside, it's not intrinsically conscious, it's not itself conscious, it is the brain stem that arouses it and makes it conscious. So that we always knew. But what I started to observe from the 1990s when I was doing this dream research is that actually these circuits that arouse the cortex and make the cortex conscious, they're not just a light switch. They are intensely affective, emotional, and qualitatively there's urgent feelings, urgent drives, impulses, that come with these circuits. How do we know that? Because we've got tons of methods we can stimulate those circuits, we can lesion those circuits, not only in human beings, also in other animals. We can record from those, we can image them during intense states, we can manipulate them chemically. Do you know almost all the drugs that psychiatrists use act on those deep stem circuits? The serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, they all come from there. So that is the thing that we had to recognize, is that the source of consciousness is not just a light switch in the brainstem. It is affect, it is feeling. So to everything that the cortex does can only be conscious if we feel our way into it. It's very important to emphasize that it's not the way that we imagine it works, but the evidence points to this, that it's not possible to have cortical processes that are conscious unless they are activated from the brainstem, and the activation from the brainstem is affective. These are two irrefutable facts. That shows us that the fundamental form of consciousness is affect, is feeling, raw feelings. Now, if you just take a step back and think about it, what does this tell us about what consciousness is? We previously thought it's something to do with perceiving the outside world. That's wrong. You can perceive the outside world unconsciously. The cortex can process all of that information unconsciously. It only becomes conscious if it's activated from the brainstem. In other words, if you feel your way into it. So if consciousness is in fact feeling, that makes us understand consciousness completely differently. Then you start thinking, but why does an animal have consciousness? It's so that it can feel how well or badly it is doing in terms of basic biological needs. So I think that the dawn of consciousness, the origins in evolution of consciousness, is when the first creatures started to be able to register subjectively, is this, what I'm doing now, is this making things better for me or worse for me within a biological value system, which means where it's good to survive and reproduce and it's bad to die and not reproduce. So feelings tell the animal whether what it's doing is good or bad. If what you're doing is enhancing your chances of surviving and reproducing, it feels good. And that motivates the animal to do that. If it's the opposite, it motivates the animal to not do that. This, I want to just add this one further point. This gives the animal the possibility of choices. If you can't feel, is this going well or is this going badly, there's only two possibilities. Either you function by reflex, in other words, you always do the same thing, or you function randomly, and it might work, it might not work. What feeling does is it says, I don't have to always do the same thing. I can try something random, and then I can adjust whether it's going well or badly by feeling whether this is working or this is not working. That is the basis of voluntary action. It's the basis of choice. It's the basis of what they call free will, in a manner of speaking. These are enormous adaptive advantages. It enables an animal to survive in novel environments, in unpredicted environments. That's what I believe, why I believe consciousness exists. Then we extend the feeling onto our perceptions. So we can say, I feel like this about that, so that we can also think consciously in relation to our feelings. What is the source of this thing that's working and not working? That's our. By the way, I'm sorry about I'm in South Africa, and here we have lots of sun. It's pouring in through my window. I'm sorry for the glare.
No, it's okay.
Oh.
I'm a little bit jealous about your son.
I'm in Spain. We have sun too, but we're in a very interesting point now. The point what advantage the consciousness was in evolution. Let us maybe focus a little more on that, because what I understood now is that consciousness arose with the advantage it brought to the beings. So
Yes.
would you say, for example, because there are a lot of advantages that work like feedback mechanisms, and would you say that this is already a form of consciousness? For example, a plant can move the leaves to the sun, but therefore it is probably not necessary to have feelings for the plant, or would you say yes, this is already a step in this direction?
I would say, first of all, I don't believe for a moment that plants have feelings. And I will say, secondly, yes, it's a step in that direction. So let me explain. Homeostasis is the basic mechanism of all living things, that we have to occupy specific viable bounds. This temperature range, this amount of water, this amount of sugar, etc. If you move out of those viable bounds, then you die. That's plants and animals. They all function like that. That is our needs. We need to be here. If we move out of that, then we got to do something to get back. So the regulation of this is by feedback. In other words, is this working? Is this not working? That's what you've just said. So the whole concept of feedback is built into homeostasis. It is a feedback mechanism. That's basically how homeostasis is regulated. But not all homeostasis is conscious. Even in us, humans, blood pressure, for example, it's homeostatic. You don't feel your way through your blood pressure problems. You know why? Because there's only two things you can do. If your blood pressure is too high, there's only two mechanisms. The one is slow down the heart rate. The other one is dilate the vessels. You do those two things, it either works or it doesn't work. There's nothing else you can do. These are called autonomic reflexes. They all feedback. So the dilation of the blood vessels and the rate of the heart's pulsating changes according to how well or badly is this doing in relation to my blood pressure. But there are only two things you can do. Those are reflexes. Plants function like that. They're vegetative. What I've just described, the blood pressure regulation, we call it the vegetative nervous system because it functions like a vegetable. In other words, it's all automatic. It's all unconscious. Plants can never come up with a novel solution. That's the crucial thing. So that feedback, all it does is there's a certain repertoire, certain number of possibilities. They either work or they don't work. If they don't work, sorry, the plant's dead. Feeling is an extended form of feedback, which enables you to do something novel. You do something, it's not like I've got three automatic options. Let all three of them automatically function. It's that none of those automatic functions is working. I'm going to try something new. And this you don't find in plants ever. So this is why I'm saying, I'm not just saying it as a matter of belief or of faith when I say I don't believe plants are conscious. Nothing about the behavior of plants is consistent with what our consciousness enables us to do. When I say our, I mean all the animals that have the brain mechanisms I've just described to you. We share them with all vertebrates. Then you can have testable predictions. You can say, if I stimulate this structure in a fish, I predict it will like it or it will not like it. I'll give you a very good example. In fishes, there's a thing called condition place preference behavior. So fish are in a tank and you put the food here, the fish all hang out there all the time. Now I say, if fishes have feelings, then if I put cocaine over there, or if I put morphine over there, they will like to go there, even though morphine and cocaine don't sustain. They're not good for the fish in terms of its nutritional needs. I predict they will go there because I believe they have feelings, because they've got the same brainstem structures as us. That prediction is confirmed. The fish hang out there. And the only thing that's good there is that it feels good. So this is the kind of science I'm talking about, upon which we this is how we formulate our hypotheses, our theories about where the consciousness comes from, what the consciousness is for, which animals have it and which ones don't have it. These are the tools that we're using. So, I mean, I know we don't have the time to go into all of it, but I can just say in summary, the evidence is overwhelming that the basic form of consciousness is feeling, and that the functionality that it contributes is choice. In other words, voluntary behavior for solving novel problems.
So just to understand a little better, the feelings that make us able to do the choice themselves, would you say they are not based on feedback mechanisms? Is this another thing, or?
No, it is a feedback mechanism, but it's a special kind of feedback mechanism. So let me quickly try to explain that. What we're talking about in homeostasis, we're talking about needs. Okay, so those are the needs of the organism. So it's my needs. Now they are valenced in the sense that they necessarily are good or bad. In other words, if I'm moving further away from where I need to be, that is bad. And if objectively, and if I'm moving closer to where I need to be, then that is good, objectively. So you've got a mechanism which is intrinsically subjective, because it's got to do with my needs. Okay, it's only good or bad for me. It's not good or bad for the universe. It's good or bad for me. Then we have, in complex organisms, we have multiple needs. It's not just I need nutrition. We have many, many, many different needs like that, us complex organisms. Now, those can't be reduced to a single common denominator. You can't say 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 8 out of 10 of thirst means 16 out of 20 of total need. So all I've got to do is sleep. If you do that, you'll die, because you have to sleep and you have to drink. You need to meet both of those needs. So those are categorical variables. In other words, they're not a continuous variable, goodness or badness. They are qualitatively distinct. 8 out of 10 of sleepiness is not the same thing as 8 out of 10 of thirst. So these are intrinsically subjective, intrinsically valenced, and intrinsically qualitative. They have to be qualitative. So this is the basic mechanism whereby feelings come about. So an animal that is using that kind of feedback, in other words, how am I doing in relation to this need, in comparison to that need, in comparison to this need? It can't just be some general quantity. It has to be qualitative, qualitatively distinct. That's a statistical mechanical necessity. And it has to be valuable subjectively, only subjectively. That just is mechanistically what a feeling is. And I'm saying that kind of feedback where the animal is trying out an action in relation to this need, the one that's prioritized now. I am now thirsty. So I have to monitor how well am I doing in relation to that need, and remember, very crucially, it's by doing something which is novel. In other words, it's trying something out which it doesn't have a predetermined reflex for. That's the part that extends the mechanism. The ordinary feedback is feedback in relation to predetermined reflexes. Here we are trying something new in relation to this range of qualitatively distinguished subjective states. That is an extended form of homeostatic feedback, and the mechanism that's driving it is the animal registering qualitatively its subjectively valent states. That just is what a feeling is. The crucial thing, Axel, that many scientists don't like to take this crucial step is that you have to take the viewpoint of the animal. It's not something you can see from the outside. You have to say, from the viewpoint of being such a creature, this is what it will experience. We're doing all kinds of experiments of that kind, which maybe we'll get to, although I know that we have limited time. But we're doing experiments based on exactly this. How can we know when the mechanism observed from the outside, how can we know from the inside what it is like to be that mechanism? But that's the crucial step, and it's a step that is justified by the mechanisms that I just described to you. When I said to you that a creature that has to monitor its own needs, and that those needs have an intrinsic goodness or badness to it only for it, that you have described something which is a subjective thing. And then you say it has to monitor those states categorically across different qualities. Then you're just mechanistically describing a system which has to have subjective states, which have qualitative, that is the ground zero of how qualia arise, in my view.
Would you say it's like a chorus of different feedback mechanisms, and
it is, yes, I understand what you're saying. The crucial thing is, number one, yes, it's a feedback mechanism. Number two is there are multiple such mechanisms which are qualitatively distinct from each other. Number three, you have to prioritize them. In other words, you can't do everything at once. So some of them get dealt with automatically.
Yeah.
And the one that's prioritized is the one that you feel. That's the one that you're feeling your way through by voluntary action. How is this going? Is this going well or badly? So please note, it's not that it's a feedback mechanism, nor that there are many of them. It's also that there's this prioritization of which one is going to be regulated voluntarily. And that's the one that becomes conscious.
Yeah. Therefore, I had the image of the chorus. There you have also the tenor and the... But okay, Dirk wants to go.
You always mentioned that there was some mechanism in it. You have a mechanistic view in it, and I've heard an interview before. You said you don't mean it in a physicalistical way. You described it as a holism. Is it right that you don't want to reduce it only the psyche to the suffices to the physical phenomenon? You make a point to describe it with physical nature laws and to want to understand the problem, the hard problem.
If we want to understand the hard problem of consciousness, we must reduce our focus to the most basic form of consciousness. That's one form of reductionism. I'm saying let's look at the most simple form of consciousness. But I'm not reducing it in the sense that I'm saying, okay, let's reduce it all to physiology. Nor am I an idealist, of course, who says let's reduce it all just to subjective experience. So if you have both, and when it comes to the vertebrate brain, we have both the physiology that we can observe it from the outside, and it has the subjective psychology. There is something it is like to be that thing from the inside. How do we combine those two perspectives, the physiological with the psychological? I'm saying we have to reduce those two perspectives to a third perspective, to an underlying ontology that explains them both. And that is why I use abstract statistical mechanical explanations. I use the language of information science, because there you have a common language. It is neither physiology nor is it psychology, but it describes the law. Those laws describe the behavior both of the physiology and of the psychology. So I'm reducing it to statistical physics.
And this is in the paper from 2018 with Carl Friston, when you investigated in free energy principle and like you mentioned before, to prove homeostasis of animals or of the brain working there. And I get a question also, do you think that you don't look at the body in this process or of the environment of this building or formation of consciousness when you see perhaps like things like embodiment or embeddedness, that also consciousness is coupled with the body or with the nestedness in the environment and some no.
Absolutely, it absolutely is. Because as you can see, what I'm saying is consciousness in its most rudimentary form. In other words, raw feelings. Its function is to meet the needs of the body. This is why we have a mind. It is so that the body can register its own states. So the mental work is in the service of the survival of the organism. So this is a deeply embodied and embedded approach, in that the only reason why the organism registers the state of the environment is because that's the only place where its needs can be met. So, you know, it has to have its own world that it is navigating in relation to its own needs and feeling its way through, you know, whether it's working or not, what it's doing. So I see the approach that I take to be very, very consistent with the embodied cognition perspective and that whole tradition that you're referring to.
Now you made him happy. Dirk likes it.
Yeah.
What did you say?
Oh, yeah.
Dirk is a fan of this embodiment.
Yeah.
He made me
Okay.
very happy now.
Yeah.
I think you're on the right track.
Thank you. When you think that consciousness is such an elemental form, or namely raw feeling, it's like surprising simple function. Could it also be assimilated on other systems like machines or something like this?
Okay, so consciousness evolved biologically for the reasons I've described. It adds enormous adaptive advantages. It makes for a much more successful organism. It evolved biologically. But if we can understand its mechanism by studying its biological forms, then it should be possible to reproduce that same mechanism in a non-biological system. The great physicist, Richard Feynman, when he died, it was written on his blackboard. Sort of like his last words. It was written on the blackboard. If I can't create it, I don't understand it. That's what he
know it. Yeah.
So I believe that's true. So if we really legitimately can claim that we have found the causal mechanism of consciousness, it's this extended form of homeostasis, which you can reduce to statistical mechanical formalisms, as I said, which is what we did in that paper with Carl Friston. That's what we did. We wrote the equation that explains this kind of extended homeostasis. If you instantiate that mechanism in an artificial system, then if that mechanism is the mechanism of consciousness, then you should be creating an artificially conscious system. If you can't do that, then you haven't found the causal mechanism of consciousness. So that's why over the last few years, we've been spending a great deal of effort to create an artificial, so it's an artificial system. The only principle that we wrote into that system is that it has to continue existing. It must do whatever it needs to do to continue to exist. And we gave it multiple needs, and we let it loose in an environment. And then you can make all kinds of testable predictions about what you expect, how you expect it to behave. And like I was saying about the fishes, you can do the same with this artificial system. And you can study the mechanisms of what's going on within the algorithmic structure that's governing this thing. Because remember, it's developing because it's this system, it comes up with novel solutions. It creates its own solutions in unexpected, in environments it hasn't ever encountered before. And we can study all the mechanisms of how is it adjusting the internal workings of its computational architecture. And in this way, we're getting very deep understanding of all of these things that we've just been talking about. Because when you're dealing with these things in artificial form, it's not only a means of proof of concept, it's also a means of studying the mechanisms in much more precise detail, because you can do that with artificial systems in ways that are much more scientifically tractable than in biological systems.
Do you think such a highly developed artificial intelligence or intelligent system would be able to dream, as you are an expert also in dreams?
So let me emphasize first of all that I'm going to come to your question, but I must just say this first of all. The whole word artificial intelligence it emphasizes intelligence, you know, and we've got these very intelligent, so-called intelligent systems that can play chess better than any human being. But all it can do is play chess. That's not so intelligent, you know, or it can play Go, which is a very difficult game, or it can solve crossword puzzles, or it can even write essays by getting all of the information on the internet to be able to produce a sensible summary of that information and put it into a linguistic form. But it's not, I don't think any of that is intelligent. It's actually functions like what we were talking about plants earlier. You know, it's just a rote reflex. You just do the same thing over and over again. It's all the thing can do. Our system is, I think, properly intelligent in that it's it uses one general principle, which is whatever problem I'm faced with, I have to confront it with the behavior that ensures that I continue to exist. And so we give it all kinds of problems. And this is what we've been doing over the last years, giving it ever more complex problems. But the irony is that our artificial intelligence, which actually functions intelligently, it's not so cognitive and intellectual. It's a very simple organism, a very simple system that only has feelings, you know, and uses those feelings to guide it. So we're actually dealing with a very simple sort of system. Now, that's why I say that is because I don't believe that the system that we're working with will dream. It's much too complex a cognitive process than our system is capable of. But I will say this, that based on what we know about dreaming and sleep, that dreaming performs a very specific function. To have the system offline, there are things that it can do in terms of its housekeeping, in terms of its predictive model. For example, simplifying its predictive model. You can't do that while you're dealing with the world coming at you. So there is functional adaptive advantage in dreaming. And so I'm saying, I think it is in principle possible to have a sufficiently complex system of the kind that we are designing, that one day it might dream. I don't think that that's impossible at all, because what dreaming involves is consciousness during sleep. What is consciousness for? It's to feel your way through a problem, but these are problems that you're feeling your way through offline. In other words, in relation to what is to be consolidated and what not, in terms of what was learned during the last 24 hours.
We trained like in a simulation.
It's exactly, yes.
Okay.
And Antonio, Damasio's theory of consciousness also mentioned this kind of stages of consciousness. He said fundamental proto-self, core consciousness, or extended consciousness. And we have an interview before with AI researcher Patrick Krauss. He want to rebuild this kind of Damasio's theory of consciousness in algorithm, and he wanted to conduct it from the AI research to the theory of consciousness with feelings. And this is very interesting that you also mentioned that consciousness have something to do with feelings or with emotions.
Yes. So let me say, I know Antonio Damasio very well, and I have the greatest respect for him. His big contribution in the 1990s was to say we need to include feeling in our understanding of how the brain works. That was his main contribution in the 1990s. At that stage, he wasn't talking about the brain stem. He was talking about feelings. Then, to his great credit, he recognized that he was focusing on the wrong place when we told him, my colleague, another colleague of mine, Jaak Panksepp, and I, we were saying, this is all brain stem. Feelings come from the brain stem. And I say again, to his credit, Damasio recognized that's true. So now he made a further step. That step was not his own, but it was a further step saying feelings are important in understanding how the brain works, and they come from the brain stem. But what he added then was that he was the one to recognize that it's homeostatic. Okay, so the fact that the basic mechanism of feeling is homeostatic, that too is Damasio's contribution. Then I started working with Friston, because Friston was reducing homeostasis to formal, to mathematical formalism. Homeostasis, as you can see from what I've said to you, it's not that complicated. And so Friston wrote a paper in 2013 called Life as We Know It, which is a brilliant paper in which he wrote the equations that govern homeostasis. So I said to Carl Friston, if Damasio is right, that feeling is basically homeostatic, and you have reduced homeostasis to mathematical formalisms, then it should be possible to reduce feeling to mathematical formalisms. That was the paper that he and I wrote in 2018, How and Why Consciousness Arises. When we wrote that paper, I sent it to Damasio before we published it. He was horrified. He was horrified at the idea that you can try to create an artificial feeling system. And I said, I find it quite amusing. It's because it's his insight. It's Damasio's insight that it's simple, it's homeostatic. Therefore, it must be possible to engineer it. But in his soul, he can't bring himself to think like that. To him, consciousness must be biological.
It sounds not so romantic that you can deduce feelings from a mathematical equation.
No. Oh dear,
when I started working, I must tell you, when I started working in that direction, I frequently thought I'm mad. You keep on losing all confidence in yourself. But as we have done that work, so I'm increasing. And nowadays, it's not such a crazy idea. There's many people speaking about the possibility of artificial consciousness.
And now, I know I said to my wife, oh, my homeostasis is not so good. The mathematical formalism in our equation is not so good. Okay. Yeah.
So you don't say I have headaches, you say my homeostasis is not so good.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I know we have to end, Dirk,
Okay.
I just want to say to you one last thing. If it's not possible to reduce subjective experience to formal causal mechanisms, then that has massive implications. It means that somehow the mental realm is not part of nature. It doesn't function in the same way as the whole of the rest of nature. And it's that I think we have to resist. So it must be possible to capture what the formal mechanisms are whereby consciousness arises. And I'm saying our best chance of doing that is by focusing on the simplest form of consciousness. And I think that there we can make real progress to bring consciousness into natural science so that we can understand how it behaves like everything else in the universe behaves.
Yeah. That's fine. Thank you very much for the
I thought I would enjoy this conversation, and I did. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mark. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you. All the best for you.
Sie auch. Danke.
Danke.
Vielen Dank. Tschüss.